the lane. I hope you missed us because we missed you here at the premier League of Legends pro scene talk show in the world. Specifically on Twitch, but certainly in the world at large. Not just because I'm here. I'm Jared Wynn, but I'm not really important. What you're really here for is the man of the hour, the man of the power, one YamatoCannon, head coach of Splice. Yamato, thank you for joining us once again.
No problem, man. It's my pleasure. You need to give yourself some credit, man. People come for you, too.
I don't know about that, but they definitely come for you in your smooth, silky voice, and of course, your wonderful tactics that have brought Splice to the forefront of the EU LCS. But we'll get to that pretty soon. We're going to start, actually, with North America, the big match of this past weekend, Immortals versus Counterlogic Gaming, the second-place team from MSI taking on really the biggest name to appear on the scene fresh this year, the calendar year 2016, and Immortals. Your initial thoughts, I heard you talking a bit before, actually, about the match. Your initial thoughts on this matchup, how it went down, let me know.
I felt like it was, the best of three in general was a question of mechanics versus a mind. I feel like COG finally are getting a grasp of their macro game. They play very, very good extended swaps where Immortals are obviously lacking. In swap games, which was all three of them, they ended up being behind because they did some kind of mistake. Huni did some kind of mistake, died level 1, died level 2. And a lot of mistakes happened from Immortals' side, but eventually the series was just concluded with this standard North American gameplay, which is really, really strange for me coming from Europe, seeing this where both teams just group and walk down mid as 5, not caring at all about side lanes. And it was really, really crazy for me to see because I've given so much props to COG about their macro game. But definitely, you know, COG are starting to look up, I think, finally with Huhi playing something very different like Aurelion Sol, he looks fine. But then when he's in these matchups where he looks like these counter matchups, as some people would say, then he looks very, very bad and is a very big weakness for COG.
Well, you play a good macro game. Of course, they played very well at MSI. I mentioned that before. Why is it they would kind of step back like this and play a more just rolling down the mid lane style? Because we know that they can do better.
I have no idea. It was very crazy for me to see, especially because they had a Hecarim into Lissandra, a matchup that is harder early on, but then Hecarim was very far ahead in the lane swap game, ended up 4-2-0, and Lissandra was 1-3, was triple C's down at some point in the game, and they just kept grouping down mid when a simple 1-3-1 would have taken home the game. When Hecarim has built Merc Threads and has MR and Trinity Force, then he's going to do very, very well into the Lissandra and the split push. And that's a very obvious way of winning the game. But instead, grouping down mid against the enemy team that had just, like Immortals just had the superior teamfight composition. And after a few fights, there was aces here and there, then eventually you're going to lose a game against a composition that has Azir and Ashe in it.
If we've seen them play better, and there's clear ways for them to win now, if they play better, if they play a more macro-oriented game, is it just a matter of them kind of falling into the mindset of other North American teams and playing that same style, and they go back to the international stage and they can play a more, you know, macro-oriented style? Is that the possible explanation? There has to be some answer for why they've regressed in this way strategically.
I feel like COG definitely showed, you know, they showed that macro prowess in game 1 and 2. I think their extended swap game was good. They kind of ran Immortals around the map because Immortals just doesn't know how to play the mid game. Unless there's a Baron up which they can force, they just don't know how to play the map. And eventually Immortals groups down mid, and I think COG kind of panicked and just responded by doing the same thing because they were confident in taking the fight because Hecarim was ahead. But I think there are much smarter ways to win the game. I think Immortals, I feel like they outdrafted COG in all 3 games, but it didn't really matter because in 2 of the games, or at least in the first one when Jax ended up very, very far ahead, then of course it didn't matter because Jackson and split push, COG all playing the game smart with the Jax split push, then it works out and COG playing the smart game, all of a sudden they have an edge on Immortals. But if they are going to play the mechanical game, I don't think they come close.
Up in the standings, played better as of late. They got off to a very slow start to begin the split. Team Liquid also playing a bit better as of late. Which of those two teams, CLG and Team Liquid, look stronger to you today?
I feel like if I would say today exactly, I think it's fairly even, but I can imagine CLG doing better as they proceed. I feel like they're trying to find their groove again. I think competing against the second best team in North America is very, very good. Even though I don't rate Immortals as highly as some people do on the world stage, I think COG definitely have qualities that can put them ahead of the others, except TSM, because I do think TSM has a very well-structured macro game compared to the other North American teams. And I think COG can compete with this macro game, but I don't think they can compete on a mechanical level. But at this point in time, I feel like the macro game is way more important. So I think as we proceed, COG is going to look better than Team Liquid.
You mentioned that you don't rate Immortals as highly as many analysts do, or some analysts do at least, certainly as many fans do. What for you is missing with Immortals? Because they have skilled players, that's pretty much inarguable. They obviously have some talent. They've put together a great run, losing only one series thus far in the North American split. So what's missing for them as a team? If you're going to come in and give like a one-day coaching seminar, what's the one thing they have to work on to get that level up that you think they need?
I think something that they do worse than TSM in this case is how efficient they are with minion waves. I think first and foremost, their lane swap game is very, very weak. In extended swap games, they tend to do decisions that don't bode well for them. They respond to dives poorly, and they end up falling behind in lane swap games. And at this point in time, being top 3, you should have lane swaps down to the punch, And on top of that, I feel like when there is no objective, like a big one that you can really, really force, like a Baron Nashor that really wins you the game, I feel like Immortals definitely don't know how to play the map. And by that, I mean, pushing the right waves and rotating around the map, pressuring the right turrets and competing in tempo and pressure. That is something they do worse when Huni is not ahead. I felt like when Huni is behind, they certainly regress in their mid game and just wait for a Baron to force, which they do like their Baron forcing is very, very good, but their mid game definitely needs improving.
What strengths do you think do they really have that? Because again, they've got an excellent record of 13-1 in series play. You can't knock them for how they've played against their competition. So what has made them play well, even if they're missing those crucial elements, you think?
I feel like draft-wise, there is a lot of things that Immortals do that I agree with. I like the high priority on Karma. I think it was crazy that against COG they had Nidalee and Karma on the same team. I don't think that should happen on 6.13. I think draft-wise they do it very, very well. I think they have this baseline strategy with Huni that works most of the time. I think their team fighting is very, very strong. It's top level. I think mechanically this team is very, very healthy and strong. So definitely there are some very good qualities on this team.
Is there a good basis, do you think, for them to improve and potentially threaten at Worlds, or are they kind of just in the state and they're not really going to get out of it?
I think definitely. I think after watching some of their series, I can't say that I have watched all of them, but most of them, they do show a lot of success in the North American playstyle that I like to call it. They kind of do better than all the other teams when it comes down to this group skirmish kind of thing that is going on in North America a lot of the times, but TSM doesn't do that, and there's a reason why they are first place, because they actually have a macro game. And I feel like if Immortals learn to play the side lanes differently than just through Huni, maybe playing a 1-1-3, and also learning how to lane swap properly, I definitely think Immortals is a force to be reckoned with.
Do you think they will?
I think they will. It's hard to say. I don't know what's going on
right
on the inside. I just remember the playoffs since last time. When Immortals completely botched it because they didn't want to play tanks in the top lane and they played AP Echo. And this, from an outside perspective, seems very, very simple to solve. And I think this mid-game issue and the lane swap issue is also something that is easy to solve. But then again, I don't know the inside workings of Immortals, so I can't say for sure.
Is there any indication that maybe teams just slip into a habit, playing so many games now in the series play, of just kind of rushing mid lane and just doing these things over and over again, as opposed to doing more structured macro play you might do if you were just playing one game at a time? Is that a thought at all, or is it still just a fault of the teams to not play better, more macro-oriented in every game?
Well, I think first and foremost, you need to recognize the mistake that you're doing. I think in anything in life, you have to review what you're doing, and if you don't recognize that you're doing something wrong because everyone else is doing it, then it's hard to improve. But in reality, it's very, very rare that I see games in Europe where teams just walk down mid. Usually it's very precise. It's 1-3-1 and coordinated pushes, objective focused, and I think this is the proper way of playing the game.
Well, we'll see if Immortals can come around to the style you prescribe, and that will probably serve them well. Is there any possibility for a team like to force that kind of play style on an opponent at an international stage, or is it just going to be the opponent can almost always overcome that with better macro play? Like, can Immortals force you to play their style?
Well, I think it really depends. You know, I think in scenarios that you are ahead in the early game, then you can kind of dictate how you want to play the game. And if Immortals manages to get a lead that is substantial, then of course they can force this type of group mid kind of thing, because if you're on the defensive, you just need to respond accordingly. But I think in games that are more even and it's all about CS efficiency and pressuring at the right time and making sure all your waves are pushed, I think they could fall behind.
I mentioned Team Liquid and CLG kind of in the same part of the standings in North America. Also in that same part of the standings is Cloud9. They've had a roster move that we did not predict here. We talked about how Bunny Fufu was a superior player to Smoothie at the support role. They've chosen to go in a different direction. They've taken up Smoothie there. Your thoughts on that move, just in general?
Well, you know, this is once again one of those scenarios where the inside workings are so important. You know, what do these two players add in terms of things outside the game and in terms of communication? You know, we can only see what they do in their specific support role, but the support role doesn't do much unless you have a clean macro game. You are a playmaker, but you need to have a play field to play on. That's just not how C9 plays. And as long as there's no play field, you can't. It's very hard to judge supports. And I think the one thing that stood out to me with Bunny Fufu was that, oh, he did some sick mechanical plays on his trash or whatever. But in reality, it is very hard to judge supports completely unless they have a playing field where they can make these plays. Like the jungler and the support, they need to have the right tools coming from the team's macro game in order for them to show how much they can or cannot do. And I think, you know, there has to be something that we don't see that supports the claim for Smoothie as support in C9.
We have to assume so. I don't know what else would be the decision maker there. We've talked about a lot of teams near the top of the standings, but the team at the top, we've mentioned them a couple times, Team Solo Mid, not just 14-0, but 28-3 in 31 games played. That is, no matter where you are, a very impressive record to have that kind of absolute dominance in your region. Simply put, what has made TSM not just the best team in the region, but such a dominant force in the region?
I feel like role for role, I think they have players that are the best in the region. I think you could argue for the top lane because it's very contested, but I think Haunter is definitely a contender for the top list. I think you could argue support as well with Bifrost, but I think the mix of Doublelift and Bifrost just makes for a very deadly bot lane, and the deadliest bot lane in North America for sure. And I think you could also argue jungle for Reignover, but in general, I think TSM have the one thing the other North American teams don't do. They have a macro game, they play around their side lanes, they have a clear plan, and I was worried about something where they just played around their bot lane throughout the early stages of the season. They've solved that. They can clearly play around their top lane, and I think they are very diverse. They can play around mid lane as well. I think the fact that they have structured diversity and a structured macro game is what gives them a massive edge of the other North American teams.
Yeah, we spoke about their individual play just now, and we didn't even mention Bjergsen, who's been one of the most dynamic players individually for the past couple of years. Because you don't have to, because you're not game planning against TSM, let me in on your secret Yamato thoughts. If you were game planning against TSM, you had a series coming up against them this week, what are your first points to look at? Like, what is TSM's weakness? Because again, undefeated, not just that, but only losing 3 individual games the whole split thus far. What can you possibly look to cut into this team?
Well, I wouldn't, you know, I'm afraid to say what I would do draft-wise because I would have to put in more work.
Sure.
But I'm sure there are some flaws you can find in the draft or somewhere where you can find value. But usually, what happens when you prepare yourself for the top teams is top teams, the reason they are top teams is because they don't have bad tendencies. For example, I remember preparing against Schalke, and they have this tendency to become very impatient in game. So that is something that we can take with us into the draft and do something specific for them. But when it comes to the top teams, for example, preparing against G2, it's no longer about tendencies. It's a question of just making use of timings, punishing mistakes, and just playing a clean game in general, because mistakes happen from the best teams, they happen. And it's just a question of giving more energy at that specific day and not making macro mistakes or mechanical mistakes, and then you just have to try to measure yourself against Team Sulamit, because the top teams, the reason they are top teams is because they don't have these bad tendencies as other teams do.
That does make sense. That's also why we see SKT lose some games occasionally. That's why they saw them lose 4 in a row at MSI. Never forget. Hashtag never forget. 0-4 for SKT and G2 and 8, of course. Never forget either of those things. Before moving on to the other part of the Atlantic, we're going to look at a couple of highlights from from the past week of the NALCS, I should say. Starting with Immortals and CLG. You mentioned minion wave control. We're going to see an issue with that here, as a matter of fact, as Immortals attempts to finish a game unsuccessfully.
Oh, this one is pretty crazy. It feels like I've seen so many of these the past weeks where teams just try to push and kind of overstay. I thought for a second that this was the replay where they are going to push for the Nexus. Am I correct, Jared?
I believe they're coming in hot.
This is the Nexus push, right?
Yeah.
This is like a classic. I feel like I see one of these like every week. But to be honest, it's very, very hard to complain about these because it's very, very close. I think making a judgment call to try to finish is completely fine because it is very, very close. But if you are not 100% sure, it might cost you the game, and in this case, it did. And I mentioned Schalke before, and I think they've done it like 3 times the split or something, where they just try to push for the Nexus. It is a fine thing to do if it is very, very close, this scenario. I think maybe if they committed completely to just go for the Nexus here, maybe it would have worked out. But it's very, very hard to say, and I think you learn from experience how much you can do and cannot do with certain minion waves and which specific champions you have. And I think based off this play, I think this is a fine decision to make. And I think in the end, they should be happy it happens in the regular split, because this type of experience comes a long way when it comes to playoffs.
So as a coach, you don't really get upset with this kind of decision making. It's just a part of learning to play the game more naturally.
Yeah. Sure, it's a question of getting a point or not, but in reality, what put them in this position in the game should be what's important. Because sometimes you just lose games because of one split decision, and these decisions very rarely appear. Sometimes you have a player that misclicks flash and flashes into the enemy team and you lose a game. Should you sit and be sad about that? No, because it rarely, rarely happens. And sometimes you're going to lose a game for a random reason, and in this case, I think you could call it a random reason because they just made a judgment call that didn't work out, and it was very, very close. But I don't think these scenarios happen too often, so you shouldn't get stuck on it, and you should just try to get as much as possible out of it.
Well, the next clip we have here is from Cloud9 versus Apex. Another close race, one team going for the Elder Dragon, one team going to end the game entirely.
So this one is quite interesting. C9, are doing the correct thing, controlling the mid wave. Something that you have to do before you contest either Baron or Dragon is you need to have control over mid wave, because if you don't, you are forced to start the objective, and they have the decision of contesting the objective or pushing down mid, which puts you in a very, very awkward position. And in this case, I think C9 have this composition that should be stronger than enemy's teams, but Apex decided to commit completely into the Dragon area, and they gave up the mid control. And if you do that, then you're going to have a bad time, because you can't really just walk into mid lane easily because that area is closed off, and you're just at the Drake pit, and you're just going to lose a game in a very sad fashion.
Which is exactly what we saw happen. So there you go. They should have listened to you before the game. They would have known not to do this, not to do that, but that's okay. Flipping over now to your region of choice, the EU LCS. We'll start with Fnatic for good reason, because Gamsu is no longer with the team. Kikis is. We've discussed this player before, and not always in the most positive light. This change for Fnatic, how does it land for you? Where do you see them going from here?
I think it's a very good upgrade. I think the fact that they had the balls to do it in the middle of the split is very, very good, because in fact, they have 4 players that are very experienced. There is no question that Yellow Star, Spirit, Reckless, Fabiven, they are experienced by this point. Throwing a new player into the mix shouldn't be hard, especially a player that has been at MSI and has won a split. And I think Kikis, at the start of the split in G2, did great things. I think some even called him the best top laner in Europe. And I think those claims were fair to make. And I think it is very, very good that he is back in LCS because he deserves it. I think the situation with G2 was kind of awkward because I think eventually, with the way he played, I think he would have been set to get the first spot as a top laner in G2. But, I think this opportunity is as good, if not better in some cases. But Fnatic definitely upgraded here.
One of the issues that's been brought up is that Spirit and Gamsu of Fnatic were good friends. This might affect Spirit's play. As a coach, how do you approach, just generally speaking now, an issue where you have to balance perhaps the good of the team in terms of skill and play versus the good of the team's chemistry?
Well, chemistry is fancy and all, but in reality, you need to remind your players that, a coach has a duty to make sure that every player gets the best opportunity given to them no matter what. And I think it's sometimes important to remind your players that that's what you're doing. And by that, I mean making sure they have the right players around them and the players that want success as much as they do. I think that is the coach's responsibility. And in this case, sure, you could argue that Gamsu and Spirit are good friends, but in reality, this is business. And in business, there is no room for emotion if you want to move forward and strive for great things. Sure, we are human, we can't remove emotions out of the equation completely, but I'm sure Spirit will bounce back because even in the games with Kikis, he played very, very well. He looked a bit sad after the games, but I think he's going to realize that it was for the better of Fnatic.
Going over to Origin now, made their own roster change, bringing in a player by the name of Toaster. Your thoughts for those who are not familiar?
Toaster, sure, I've seen him in solo queue a couple of times, but he looks very unimpressive to me on a weak Origin. I think it's hard to look impressive on a lot of issues. Something that was strange was that Toaster got 3 Jhin bans against him, and then eventually he played Jhin, and it didn't look too good. So I'm not sure why he received those bans, but Jhin is obviously something that he's known for, whatever, I think it's too soon to judge him. Jhin, they have faith in him and look to him as a player that can grow. But his first initial performance was not some superstar performance. Was on average maybe 50 CS behind on the end of at the end of the game, and I'm not too impressed, and I'm not really excited for the future of Toaster.
What about the future of Origin? Are you excited about that?
Well, it would be interesting to see this team in relegations, but I think they have so many issues. I remember hearing the interview of Aranea that he said that his main idea is to make sure that the players work together and as a unit. And I think that's something that has been very lacking from Origin's side. There are a lot of things that Origin has done or said in the past that I disagree with in terms of how they look at coaching and how they look at growth in general, and some of the comments they made towards players that have left the roster for better things. And I think definitely they are going towards the way that everyone saw them going, because they disregarded a lot of things because things were going well for them. They kind of pulled, a C9 of some sort where they kind of collapsed because they didn't improve their structure. But, the beauty of C9 is the fact that they went through the gauntlet when they finally picked their shit up. But I don't think Origin is going to do the same.
Not to take sides or anything, but I mean, Splice obviously values coaching. They have you, and look at how Splice has done the split. Origin, perhaps not as much. Look at how they've done. I'm not to take sides, but it would seem to be a trend there where the team that values coaching shoots up, and the team that does not kind of goes to relegation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be a thing. Just pointing it out. Again, not taking sides here, but yeah, that is a thing.
I like to think that coaches are useful. Yeah.
Speaking to players and new additions and teams, an interesting one here, Forgiven, is not just a new joining member. He's back with H2K. This is a player I'm not sure what to think. He's shown great skill in the past and has had some really good results, but he's obviously emotional, obviously has some chemistry issues, the magical word we mentioned before. Any chance that he's a productive player and a starter for H2K this year?
Well, I wouldn't be too sure. Like, I do think Freeze is an underperforming member of H2K. I think he definitely, like Freeze, in my eyes, is a player that I would call a KDA player that just tries to look good. And it worked on worse teams, but now he's finally on one of the better teams, and he has a responsibility more than to just look good. And I think he's not performing. But with that in mind, I think this Forgiven situation, I wouldn't think that he's going to jump into the roster again because there were internal issues in the past with Forgiven. I think what happened between H2K and Origin, I think, as it seems, I'm just making guesses here, that H2K sent him out as a loan to Origin. And then he just came back, and that's it. That's how I read the situation so far.
We'll see if it comes to any fruition for H2K. One more team making a change here, Rollcat, bringing in Memento, more of a solo queue player. Hard to judge this one from the outset. Your thoughts on this deep into a split and really a year of play, bringing in a largely untested player like this?
Like Airwax, he had his moments where he soloed through games, and I also think he had moments where he played good. I'm not sure if, the jungle role did show a lot of weakness from Rocket because it was very one-dimensional, only play around mid lane, and if that didn't happen, like if they didn't have success in doing that, then all of a sudden the game was over for Rocket. Will Memento save Rocket? I don't think so, because, you bring in a player that hasn't played in the LCS when your issue is that you look as if your team looks like you have never played in LCS. And I don't think Memento's going to solve that, because the biggest issue for Rocket is they don't know how to play the late game. They don't know how to play the mid game. They only have one way of playing the early game, and their draft is complete garbage.
That's a tough set of things to fix, actually. Not knowing how to play parts of the game.
It's just, if a team is blind picking Echo 3 patches later after he was nerfed, then something is a problem.
Yeah.
Like you just, every draft that I've seen from Rocket is just 3 weeks behind. Just this week they blind pick Vladimir first pick, and it's just crazy because it's as if they are checking the draft that happened 3 weeks ago, and they're like, holy moly, no one has seen this. Let's do this. Oh, these champs got nerfed. Unfortunate.
Maybe they haven't seen the patch notes.
Yeah, that's a useful thing to read,
Just unlucky, perhaps. Just unlucky,
Yeah.
Could be,
Sure.
possible. Now, our biggest series of the week in Europe, now that we've gotten the roster moves out of the way, involved your team, actually. Splice playing G2. You may have seen this series, actually. You may have watched it yourself. Having watched, I assume you watched it. Assuming you watched it, how did you feel about G2 versus Splice?
I felt like it was a very, very competitive series. I was very, very happy with the outcome. I think game one looked a bit sloppy. Game one was basically G2 taking a lead with their composition with Gangplank and Jhin, which was very, very lethal and dangerous, and we didn't really respect it too much in mid lane. We did create some plays with Shen, and eventually, after one play with Shen didn't work out as we initially planned, we kind of stopped doing it because we lost confidence, and obviously against G2 we're going to get punished. And we didn't really respect the combination of Gangplank ultimate into Jhin, but eventually they kind of overcommitted into a team fight, and Malzahar did Malzahar things, and we got Baron. I feel like the second game was a complete mirror of what happened in the first one. We got an early lead, we had the casted and rolling, we were pushing every lane, we had pressure on every lane, and we had the picks that we wanted, and eventually we were supposed to go in for a free mid tower, a juicy one, some money, some moolah in the pocket, but we decided to dive 3 towers deep, and we lost 4 good men on that day, and we lost Nashor, and obviously against G2 we're going to lose the game. So I feel like the 2 games were mirrors of each other, 2 teams throwing a game, but that's what happens, It's a question of who has the patience to not make a mistake when you're ahead.
That's a good question, and I guess we have that answered during that series. Splice, just generally speaking, has played a lot better this split, of course. That's no secret here. I want to ask you, though, if your team is improving as they have and getting up towards the top of the standings as they have, and they've come so far, they're getting praised now pretty broadly. How do you keep the pressure up? I don't know if pressure is even the right word. How do you keep the team driven to continue that improvement and not settle for, hey, we're now a top 3 team deep into the split, we're doing just fine?
It's just, I've made sure that the boys understand that results don't mean jack shit. The thing is that I've made sure to the boys that they've learned in the first split that we played that the results don't matter. What we do with every hour and every minute that we put into the game is what matters. The results come later always. And, with losses in mind, we had a lot of them in the first split. The one thing that kept us in check and kept us going was the fact that we were working hard and we gained a lot out of our losses. And we are still, we need to make sure now that we keep applying the same principles, that we try to get as much as possible out of our experience. And, I've been asked the question a lot, when will we be satisfied, or when are we happy? When will we relax and take it easy? When do we deserve vacation? The answer is never. Because if we are comfortable and we are content and we are happy with where we are, then we will fall behind. Because, League of Legends in any sport is a race, and you just need to keep racing forward, because otherwise everyone's going to run past you. So we just need to keep practicing efficiently and going forward and always trying to gain as much as possible out of any experience.
I do have to correct you there. I believe the correct time to take a vacation is after winning the split and then before MSI. That's the vacation time. Just keep that in mind for next year when you have the opportunity. It's proven to work.
Sure.
yeah, proven. 100% proven. So we have top 3 teams here. We mentioned them all, G2, Fnatic, and Splyce. Do you feel pretty confident this is the top 3 moving forward in the European LCS?
I think next week is going to be kind of defining for that. I think our match between H2K, between us and H2K is going to be the deciding factor, because I do think H2K can catch up if things go very right for them, but I can't imagine that happening because they're facing us. No, I'm just kidding. But besides that, I think the top 3 is pretty set. I think you could say that G2 almost 100% are guaranteed first place, and I think us and Fnatic are going to duke it out for second place.
What about the next 4 teams that we have? H2K, you mentioned, Giants, Unicorns of Love, and Vitality. Which of those 4 teams do you think is the biggest threat to make a push to the top 3?
So you mentioned
H2K, Giants, Unicorns, and Vitality.
To push for top 3?
Yeah. A biggest threat to you, in fact. The biggest threat to your team.
I would say it has to be H2K. Okay. I think H2K have good qualities, but they also have glaring bad ones. I think their team fighting and their shot calling when they are behind on specific roles like top lane is something that falters through, and they look kind of underwhelming in the mid to late game. But if the right people get rolling, and if they get the correct drafts, which they usually do with Proli on the helm, then H2K looks up and kind of look like a good team. But they definitely have weaknesses. But I do think H2K is the strongest team out of these 4. I do think UL is kind of a dark horse because they tend to play so much different compared to the other teams. I think VC Sachi is definitely a very, very smart player and one of the best top laners Europe has to offer. And I also think Hili-Sang has a way to play. He has a very surprising way to play. When you play against UL, you need to keep track of minion waves at all times, because UL like to do these plays where they don't take minion waves and just sit in the bush. And it's very, very surprising, because it is very normal for a player to think, oh, we pushed in the wave, we can push in for vision. But in reality, what you need to do against UL is just sit back, relax, and make sure they lose these minions while they sit in these bushes. But it's very, very hard to do that, because UL are the only ones that tend to do these plays. And I think with that in mind, UL can do some freaky shit.
Some freaky shit. That sounds pretty intimidating, actually. Some freaky shit from Unicorns of Love. A less bright part of the table at the bottom, actually. Any chance that Rokat catch Origin, or should I say, any chance Origin play so much worse they fall below Rokat? Any chance of that happening at all?
I think I think it's. I don't think these teams are gonna get a lot more points. I think the series between Oregon and Rocket that happened last week was pretty defining for who is going to get which spot.
Right.
So I think Origin is going to be they're going to be ahead of Rocket in the standings throughout the split.
Yeah, it seems likely. Let's go actually to a highlight from one of your games, Splice versus G2. I believe we have a Baron fight here. You may have seen this one.
No, is this the one where G2 throws? Oh, yes, it is. I think actually they already did the throw. It happened early on in the game, and at this point in time, I think we were winning quite heavily in the split push, and they didn't really have a response to the Malzahar. And of course, if you don't win the game early on with the GP, with the Rumble, these champions are going to fall off, and the Gangplank ultimate equalizer isn't going to do as much. As soon as Caitlyn reaches BT, and all this kind of side damage is not going to do as much. And then, at this point in time with Malzahar and Caitlyn scaling into the game, they just need to force, because G2 knows for a fact that they're going to lose eventually, because we just outscale them so heavily. We play a stronger 1-3-1 at this point in time as well. So this is just G2 saying, oh, let's force Baron. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but we just have to do something.
Our next clip is from Schalke versus Fnatic, where we have Fnatic starting a fight and then Schalke continuing the fight. I think we just went right into it.
I remember this game. This game was crazy. It's always with Fnatic and Schalke where it's a question of 15 steals and 15 Elder Dragons and 10 Nashes. It's always crazy with these ones. I think in this particular fight, it's important to highlight that Sivir and Vladimir are very, very good in the late game, but I think Azir does very, very well into these champions, but a very, very good Vladimir ultimate kind of sets up the tone for the fight, but you never want to rush into an Azir, and it's very, very dangerous. But, it's a question of overcommitment into overcommitment and then another overcommitment. It's just something good happens and the team gets overeager. I think it happened for Schalke, and then it happened for Fnatic, and then, when it happened for Fnatic, it was the final nail in the coffin.
Let's take a moment now to look over to the Asian region, specifically Korea. SK Telecom T1 seemed absolutely dominant earlier in the split. They're still looking pretty good, but they're no longer alone. ROX Tigers and Samsung actually are right there with them. Do you see any real weaknesses in SKT today, or are they just doing the same thing they did before, where they play, they do what they have to do, and by the end of the split, they're going to be the same SKT world beaters we know them to be?
I feel like, when it comes to SK Telecom, when the games are unimportant, I remember reading an interview that was with Faker, of course. He said that in games that are not important, he tends to get nervous, and then when games are important, he doesn't care and just plays his heart out. And that has been the trend for SKT. Whenever they've lost, it's because the games don't seem that important. At MSI, they lost a couple of games, but then they just had to turn on the heat, and all of a sudden they crushed everyone again. And I felt a similar thing happened this split as well, in, of course, LCK, where they lost games against teams that no one can imagine they would lose again in such a horrible fashion, and then they just turn on the heat again and play very, very well again.
Do you think ROX Tigers are a real world threat? I mean, I know they always look good, and they still look good today. We've seen them go far before. Can this team on the big stage, big question here obviously, can this team on the big stage actually come through? Do they have the chops?
I think, right now, with ROX Tigers, I feel like in a world where SKT doesn't exist, I think ROX Tigers is definitely a top contender for the first place in the World Championship. But sadly, SKT exists. But ROX Tigers do have a lot of good qualities. I think the meta fits them with a lot of variety in what you can play. There is a lot of things that are good. And I think ROX Tigers shine in these situations. A lot of these AD carries fit into Prey's playstyle, and I think, generally speaking, variety is good for ROX Tigers, and the meta screams variety.
Yeah, SKT's existence is a problem for many teams, actually. That tends to be an issue for anyone looking to win Worlds or to win anything that SKT is at. Even if you beat SKT 4 times in a row, they'll still come back and beat you in the end. It's just that it's what they do. Stepping back now, looking at the meta we currently have, the champions, the map play, our favorite thing to talk about here, Malzahar. He's in there. He's a presence. He's being picked in actual competitive games. Is this a thing long term, or is it kind of a flavor of the week pick?
I think Malzahar, if he doesn't get nerfed or other things don't get buffed, I think Malzahar is definitely here to stay. His passive is very, very strong. I think the fact that it allows him to escape that initial touch, which is usually how ganks work, Bard ultimate, CC, that's initial touch that is going to kill you if you're a mage. Surviving from that is very, very strong. And Malzahar, in mid lane, you're always looking for champions that can push a lot. Malzahar screams pushing. And also the fact that his 1v1 potential with items is simply magnificent. And that is also very, very good and healthy in a meta where 1-3-1 is very, very strong.
What about the newest addition to the crew here, Taliyah?
Well, Taliyah, she's quite an interesting pickle. You know, it's hard to find out and kind of place her in team composition because she's just so different. I feel like almost Taliyah makes a composition because you can do so much with the ultimate. Like from our perspective in Splice, we've played both top lane and mid lane, and I think the main reason it worked out for us is because there is some kind of surprise factor coming in with this specific champion. Like Malzahar, you know, everyone has played against Malzahar, everyone knows how it works. You know, he kind of does this straw thing where he sucks you, and you know you try to cancel it or else you're dead. Everyone knows how Malzahar works, but when it comes to Taliyah, you know, she has this wall, you know, Donald Trump, and she can take over Baron, she can gank very, very well, and I think this catches a lot of teams off guard, and we have managed to grab a lot of wins with this champion.
She's going to build that wall. I look forward to it. Well, she's already built it, I guess, multiple times. It's been torn down and then rebuilt multiple times. It's a quick process. Our last mid-lane champion we're going to talk about here, Rise, his new rework. He's been touched up once again. How do you feel about him today?
I think he's really, really funky. I like the fact that his Q has a very long range, but it's very hard to hit on max range. I think this champion has very, very high DPS numbers, but the problem with him now, it's kind of hard to reach the right targets unless they're running into you. He no longer has the movement speed that he gained from his ultimate before, and he no longer has the spell vamp, which was very, very helpful when you know, you try to survive these damage things that just happen to you in a team fight, like a Gangplank ultimate or whatever, like this side damage that always happens. So I think when you are such a low-range champion and you need to get in there and get your hands dirty, movement speed is very important, and spell bump is very, very important. And I think with that in mind, I think Rise is in a weaker state than before. But I do think this ultimate is a very interesting mechanic which you can do a lot of crazy things with, and I'm hoping to see a lot of it, and maybe I'll prepare some myself.
You perhaps should. I want to see actually you in the game, not just as the coach. Like, I want to see you and there with Rise. Can we see that?
Sure, man.
Any chance?
I'll give a pling to Riot Games.
Yeah, if Splice runs the table and is that far out front in first place, perhaps you can get in there and play a couple games for us, just for fun, you know. Just
sure, man.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm sure your players won't mind. They'll be fine with it too. Yeah, they won't mind. No one will mind.
Has actually happened in scrims sometimes. You know, I don't want to mention any specific teams because they'll be pissed. But when we've had like a series that is easier than others, and we just want to enjoy ourselves, then I sub in. So there are teams out there in LCS that have lost against me. I'm not going to mention who.
Yeah, not going to mention names. Rokat obviously being one, but not going to mention names. Not going to go there. Getting back to the top lane now, or actually going to the top lane to begin with. Illaoi, she's been a presence, kind of gimmicky. Wasn't sure about her. Riot buffed her up quite a few times, trying to make people play her, force her into the metagame. She's here now. Is she going to stick around towards Worlds?
Oh, Illaoi is, to me, very, very interesting. You know, she kind of speaks to me like Illaoi to me is like Darius. She shines in situations where people run into her, and that's always not the case. You know, there are situations where you're going to be very, very kited in team fights. So it's very important that you set up Illaoi for success, because she can't play in two ways. She always needs to push and play aggressive and reach the point where she can just 1v2 the enemy jungler and the top laner. And I think gimmicky is the right word, because you can't always guarantee yourself to get the situation for Illaoi. and she kind of passively pushes when she trades, which makes her a champion that is very, very easy to punish in some scenarios when she doesn't end up being ahead. But when she is ahead, it is very, very dirty, the amount of damage she can do. You know, she can just one-shot 1 or 2 or 3 people sometimes. And I think she has a place in some specific teams that are very, very top lane centric, like, for example, Immortals.
How about Gangplank? Not that long ago, Gangplank was an auto ban. He was always out of there. Kind of faded away. Now he's again a presence to some extent. Do you see him being sticky?
I think the only reason Gangplank has come back is because the rise of Malzahar. He can just eat fruit, and Malzahar doesn't have an ultimate. That's unfortunate. And also the fact that GP is very, very good into Shen. Shen is a champion that has appeared and is played all over the place, has insane win ratios all over the place, and Gangplank is something that does very, very well into it because, you know, you are going to outscale it in lane, you're going to be able to push it. You can also just eat your fruit out of his taunt, which is Shen's bread and butter. And, you know, without the taunt, he can't really do much DPS. He's rather clunky. And also, you know, when the biggest reason why Shen is so popular now is because of the recent teleport nerf. And I think Gangplank's ultimate is as powerful as a Shen shield plus Shen being there in person, for example, in the bot lane fight, because Gangplank ultimate is just so amazing in these early game fights. So I think Gangplank, the only reason we've seen Gangplank is because it's a counter pick to Shen.
Well, it's all about that TP mobility. Where's the Pantheon picks? Where's my friend Pantheon? What's he doing? You don't see it yet?
He's baking, man.
Okay, well, that's good to know. At least he's doing something. Last champion we're going to talk about here, Gnar, the big, fuzzy, well, sometimes small, sometimes big, fuzzy champion that we all know and love. He's again a presence. He's kind of had his moment in the sun before, faded out for a while, and now once again here. It tends to happen that way. It's all cyclical for most champions. Or, like, Yorick never gets played at all. So, you know, some champions don't ever get the moment in the sun. But still, Gnar is here. Your thoughts on the current position Gnar has in the meta?
Well, Gnar is always a champion that is good into these beefy top laners that tend to have a lot of HP, armor, and the beauty of Gnar is the fact that he has mixed damage, magic damage coming in from his mini Gnar passive, of course, and I think he always does very, very well into these tanks. And, you know, on top of that, I think Gnar appears a lot when there are a lot of top lane bans. I think when Aurelia is out and Olaf is out, there is not a lot of things that can do very, very well into Gnar. And of course, you can pick Yasuo, but who as a top laner has put in enough games of Yasuo to be able to play it on stage? So I think Gnar has a sense of consistency in game. You know, he has the safety about him, and you can always rely on Gnar being Gnar. You know, it's not like Illaoi where some games he's going to be completely useless, and some games he's going to go off, but Gnar is kind of like this all the time. And sometimes he does this amazing ultimate, like when Fnatic played against us and we got smacked 5 people into the wall. That happens. And sometimes it doesn't happen, but there is a sense of consistency with Gnar that is very reassuring, and it's a good blind pick overall when some of these top laners are banned.
A good pick. I appreciate Gnar. He's always fun to watch. Well, not always fun to watch, but he can be very much fun to watch. Good champion. I like him. I approve. I'm sure Riot is glad that I approve of the champion, Gnar. That's a good, important thing for them. I hope you all approved of the show. It was a good time for me. Happy to be back here with YamatoCannon talking about the LCS, the LCK, EU, NA, not the LPL today, but one day, the LPL as well. Talking about the best champions, the worst champions, the best players, worst teams, the best coach. YamatoCannon, of course, foremost among all those things. Thanks for joining us.
Blush, man.
Not the first time. Thanks for joining us, of course. We'll be back here at the same time next week.